What's up, kids? Um, Today I'm reading the first section from part 2 of Anselm Jappe's book Guy Debord. I'm reading this. I'm not reading the whole chapters of this book because they're very long. There's only 3 of them, and it's 150 pages. So I'm gonna record these all as like individual videos. Oh, okay, so this section is about the Letterist International and is titled The Letterist International. Quote, "We did not seek the formula for changing the world in books, but by wandering," end quote. Debord's reformulation of the theories of Marx as described in Part 1 was not the product of academic research and even less of militant political action in either the small or large left-wing parties. The working out and dissemination of Debord's theory was more of a passionate adventure than a lecture series on Marxology. It was in the Latin Quarter of Paris in cafes avoided by respectable students just a stone's throw from the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, where the future elite were preparing their careers, that the young Guy Debord set out on a journey thanks to which he too would leave a certain mark on the world. Looking back later, Debord expressed the certitude that the disorder that overtook the world in 1968 and that would never be completely eradicated had its source at a few cafe tables where in late 1952 a handful of somewhat strayed young people calling themselves the quote Letterist International end quote used to drink too much and plan systematic rambles that they referred to as the Reeves. Quote, "It is wonderful to see," end quote, observed Debord apropos of this period in his film In Giram Imo Nacht e Consumim Mu. I don't know. Igni. Quote, "that disturbances with the tiniest and most ephemeral of origins have eventually shaken the order of the world," end quote. From that time forward, Debord and his friends were, quote, "in possession of a very strange power of seduction, for no one has approached us since then without wishing to follow us," end quote. The Debordian adventure proceeded logically from this starting point. It had become necessary, quote, "to discover how to live the days that came after in a manner worthy of such a fine being. You want to prolong that first experience of illegality forever after," end quote. For a clear understanding of Debord's ideas, then, we need to pay attention to his deeds. Referring to himself, Debord quotes Chateaubriand, quote, "Of the modern French authors of my time, I am therefore the only one whose life is true to his works," end quote. The great rarity of such consistency explains, quote, "why those who expound various thoughts about revolution to us ordinarily abstain from letting us know how they have lived their lives," end quote. Something Debord does not fail to do. Debord's singularity is further underscored by the fact that he could write, quote, "We did not go on television to say what it was that we had understood. We did not hanker after grants from the scientific research bodies, nor for praise from newspaper intellectuals. We brought fuel to the flames," end quote. Debord. The significance of Debord's early activities, which at the time passed virtually unnoticed, is pointed up by his conviction that the animosity that was always directed at Debord went back to those days. Quote, "Some think that it is because of the grave responsibility that has often been attributed to me for the origins or even the command of the May 1968 revolt. I think rather that was what has displeased people so persistently about me is what I did in 1952, end quote. Debord, Panegyrics. So there's a section on like abbreviations here because he's like saying what books. Yeah, there's a section on abbreviations. OCC.
I'll see you later on today.
Okay.
All right, I'll see you then.
But what did Debord do in 1952 aside from making a curious film, so to speak, and helping found the Letterist International? According to Debord, it was in 1952 that with, quote, 4 or 5 scarcely recommendable people from Paris, end quote, Debord set out in search of, indeed glimpsed, quote, the, quote, Northwest Passage, end quote, of the geography of real life, end quote. This quest eventually developed into a social war in which theories were units of varying strength, quote, which must be engaged at the right moment in the combat, end quote. That Debord should have been, quote, a sort of theoretician of revolutions, end quote, was thus, quote, the falsest of legends, end quote. For the development of a theory was but one element, albeit an important element in a complex set of interactions. Footnote. Some years later, however, Debord would write that of all the epithets applied to him by the French press, quote, theoretician, end quote, was the only one except for enragé, to which he had no objection. The attribution went, quote, without saying, although I have not been just a theoretician, nor have I been a specialist in that capacity, still I have indeed been a theoretician also, and one of the best, end quote. Debord. The point of departure was, quote, the supersession of art, end quote, which was to be achieved by starting out from a, quote, modern poetry, end quote, in the throes of, quote, self-destruction, end quote. Quote, after all, it was modern poetry for the last 100 years that had led us there. We were a handful who thought that it was necessary to carry out its program in reality, end quote. Debord, Panegyrics. There is no doubt that Debord always remained faithful to this vow. The, quote, supersession of art, end quote, first presented itself to Debord in the garb of Letterism. Born in Paris on the 28th of December 1931, Debord had aspired since his adolescence to a life full of adventures. Debord's models being le traitement, I don't know, whom the Surrealists had deemed the supreme exemplar of the individual utterly at war with all bourgeois values, and pre-Dadaist adventurer Arthur Craven. Debord was hardly tempted to pursue either an artistic or a university career. In 1951, at the Cannes Film Festival, Debord ran across a group showing a film called Traité de Bave et d'Eternité, Treatise on Slobber and Eternity, to a chorus of boos and hisses. Treatise on Slobber and Eternity had no images, and onomatopoeic poetry and multifarious monologues were all it had for a soundtrack. This group was Isidore Isou's Letterists. Isou was, I don't know if I'm saying that right, so it's Isou. I'm going to say Isou. Romanian born in 1924, had begun as early as 1946 to urge the Parisian cultural establishment to undertake a renewal, not just of the arts, but of the entirety of civilization. Footnote. A standard account of Letterism is Jean-Paul Courtet, Les Poésies Letteristes, published in 1974. End footnote. Re-embracing the iconoclastic goals of the Dadaists and early Surrealists, Isou meant to complete the self-destruction of artistic forms initiated by Baudelaire. For him, the leap needed to achieve this end was the reduction of poetry to its smallest component, namely the letter. The letter was at once a graphical element suitable for use in collage and a sound element suitable for use in onomatopoeic declamation, and hence a link between poetry, painting, and music. With a small number of followers, Isou extended this procedure and others to every artistic and social realm, including cinema and architecture. From the point of view of art history, it should certainly be acknowledged that the Letterists owed a great deal to Dada. One has merely to think of Kurt Schwitzer's Sonat. It is also true that they originated not a few of the ideas with which the quote avant-garde and quote artists of the 1960s bedazzled the public. Isou's letterism already embodied in large measure the spirit that would later animate Debord and the situationists, as much in their fidelity to letterism as in their transcendence of letterism. The chief thing the two movements have in common is the conviction that the whole world must be torn down and rebuilt under the sign of the economy. Rebuilt not under the sign of the economy, but instead under that of a generalized creativity. The entirety of traditional art was certified dead by both groups, while the alternative to it was another invention of Isso's, namely détournement, a collage-like technique whereby pre-existing elements were reassembled into new creations. According to Isso, art always initially art always goes initially through, quote, amplic phases, end quote, during which a rich panoply of expressive means is developed, and then through, quote, chiseling phases, end quote, which first strive to perfect the work, then gradually strip away all the resulting refinements. Footnote. According to Isso, Baudelaire destroyed the anecdote, Verlaine the poem, Rimbaud the verse, and Zara the word, which he replaced by the nothing. Only Isso had the courage to reduce everything to letters, thus giving form to nothing. End footnote. Other themes that would later assume prime importance for Debord were the desire to transcend the division between artist and spectator, and the incorporation of action and emotion, or in other words, lifestyle, into the arts. The letterist promotion of youth as a sociological category at the same time a potentially revolutionary force was another genuine anticipation of the 60s, one that Debord would never completely embrace, but that left a significant mark on Debord nevertheless. The same may be said of Isso's propensity for inventing new forms of expression rather than executing works of art and then claiming paternity for anything resembling his techniques. Last but not least, letterists already manifested an inclination to believe that their little group had been chosen to preside over the palingenesis of the world, a conviction attended by an agreeable megalomania, but also inevitably by sectarianism and chronic squabbling. The Isso group was also much given to organizing small scandals, which was still fairly easy at the time. They disrupted theatrical performances, gallery openings, and film festivals. All this, combined with their non-conforming style, made the letterists attractive even to some young people whose interests were not strictly of an artistic kind. A particularly tumultuous scandal was provoked at Easter 1950 when a young man dressed as a Dominican appeared in the pulpit of Notre Dame Cathedral and informed the congregation that, quote, God is dead, end quote. This action ended with an attempted lynching, the impostor's arrest, and headlines in all the papers. Debord writes that no sooner was he fully independent than he found himself feeling, quote, quite at home in the most ill-famed company, end quote. Debord's own contribution was not long in coming. On the 30th of June 1952, Debord showed his first film, Hurlement en faveur de Sade, Howling in Favor of Sade, an early and never used scenario for which had previously appeared in the sole number of the letterist journal Eon. Footnote. This first script is reproduced in Berby, is in Berby. For an account of the genesis and exhibition of the Howlings in Favor of Sade, see Thomas Y. Levin, Jesus Christ. Quote, Dismantling the Spectacle, the Cinema of Guy Debord, in passage 81 to 85. End footnote. The outrage caused by this film was not of the kind. Yeah, when are you leaving?
Sorry, the nurse called. She's on her way. We want to meet the nurse.
Alright, I'm waiting for Matthew and Kirsty.
Alright, do they know that?
I don't know, I'll call them. Little window into my life. The outrage caused by this film is not of a kind that its audience probably expected from the title. The screen is sometimes dark, sometimes white, but always blank. While the soundtrack consists of quotations from the widest variety of sources, observations on the life of the letterist, and a few theoretical propositions, all frequently interrupted by long stretches of silence, the work ends with 24 minutes of complete silence and complete darkness. Though first shown by a film club described as quote, avant-garde, end quote, the film was cut short after a mere 20 minutes by an utterly indignant audience. Footnote. A screening in London in 1957 drew a large crowd, doubtless attracted by the title. In 1991, when a German version, obviously not difficult to produce, was shown in Berlin, the notoriety of Debord's first film, now so utterly out of circulation, again lured a good number of enthusiasts. The occasion proved that in 40 years the film had lost some of its power. Had lost none of its power to scandalize. Furious spectators interrupted the performance and stole all the copies on hand of a book on the SI, whose appearance this showing was intended to publicize. Just such a rude challenge to passivity had, of course, always been Debord's purpose. End footnote. End footnote. In the first moments of the film, the following words are heard, quote, "Cinema is dead. Films are no longer possible. If you want, let's have a discussion," end quote. The intent of the provocation was to transcend the passivity of the spectator. Debord was no longer concerned, as the 2 or 3 earlier Letterist films had been, with the search for a new aesthetic. On the contrary, he wanted to draw a line under even the most recent art. In consequence, he and his friends were very soon at loggerheads with Isou and his faithful followers, whose cult of, quote, "creativity," end quote, constituted in their eyes a dangerous form of idealism. Debord and those in his camp wanted their action to be informed by a social critique of Marxist inspiration, though still in a somewhat vague way, and they rebuked the so-called, quote, "old letterist," end quote, or, quote, "right-wing letterist," end quote, for being too positive, for being, quote, "artists," end quote. In November 1952, at a meeting at Aubervilliers, 4 people founded the Letterist International. Footnote. For his part, Isou had proceeded tirelessly until the time of this writing with his multifarious work, waiting imperturbably for the day when the whole world recognizes him as one of humanity's great geniuses, irked, however, by the realization that his sometime followers' reputation surpassed his own. Isou has for more than 30 years been waging a grotesque hate campaign against Debord. The title of one of the lampoons gives the measure here: Contre le cinéma situationiste neo-Nazi of 1979. Interestingly, after the ritual attacks associated with the break itself, Debord paid no further attention to Isou, and when in 1979 Isou proposed to Debord's publisher and friend, Gerard Lebovici, that he publish some of Isou's writings, in which he compared Debord to Goering, Lebovici's response, certainly inspired by Debord, was curiously mild. In a kind of respect for Debord's first, quote, master, is it kind of respect for Debord's first, quote, master, end quote, to be discerned here, question mark. End footnote. One may be sure that at the time hardly anyone took note of this announcement by a few young, quote, marginals, end quote, in a dive in the Paris banlieue, especially considering that such declarations must have been to a penny in certain circles at the time. Nevertheless, 40 years later, the sheet of paper on which the 4 set forth their principles in 20 lines would be treated as a historic document and reproduced in a large illustrated volume. See Robert Oert, Phantom Avant-Garde, published in Hamburg by Nautilus Press in 1990, end footnote. This surprising fact must undoubtedly be attributed to the intervening, quote, career, end quote, of Guy Debord. Before tracing the itinerary of this extraordinary organization, let us pause for a moment to examine the historical context in which it came into being. The 1920s in France, especially the first half of the decade, were highly effervescent, and to some degree this effervescence persisted into the 30s. In contrast, the political and cultural climate after the liberation, apart from a brief moment of euphoria, was strictly gray and certainly at a very far remove from any kind of revolutionary breakthrough. Surrealism had no doubt lost much of surrealism's original innovativeness as early as 1930. After the Second World War, however, the movement's decadence was brutally patent. For one thing, surrealism was now welcome in the temples of bourgeois art, just as surrealism was in the world of advertising, and meanwhile many of surrealism's adepts had taken a distinctly mystical turn. On the outside of France, could surrealism still exert an influence, at least indirectly, as it did on the Cobra movement in Denmark, Belgium, and Holland, or via Marcel Marien's Belgian group? In France, on the other hand, what emerged was a new, slightly, quote, avant-gardist, end quote, academicism in painting, the so-called Paris school. On the literary front, the well-worn values, the Mauriacs and Guides, remained firmly in place, while any real innovative tendencies were apparently exhausted. Where's André Breton in all this. Things were even more clear-cut in the political sphere. The only seeming opposition to the bourgeois forces was the French Communist Party, evicted from the government in 1947, but commanding a quarter of the popular vote and immense respect even from the other parties on account of the Communist Party's role in the resistance and the Communist Party's, quote, national, end quote, policies. Completely enthralled to the USSR of Stalin, the French Communist Party displayed a delusional dogmatism that led the French Communist Party, for example, at the beginning of the 1950s to denounce a, quote, absolute pauperization of the proletariat, end quote, or to rave about a, quote, proletarian logic, end quote. In France, more than in any other Western country, the Communist Party conducted a veritable reign of terror over the intellectuals, successfully silencing any thinking on the left that did not correspond to the Communist Party's manuals. It is hard to identify a single intellectual of that period, except of course for bourgeois intellectuals who did not at least for a time fall into line, and this goes too for all those who, just as few years later, would constitute swarms of professional anti-Stalinists. After 1945, the Le Thème Moderne sought to develop a critique of Stalinism, but significantly three of its founders, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Raymond Aron, and Albert Camus, soon joined the liberal camp, while the fourth, Sartre, even more significantly, engaged in obscene mental contortions in defense of the, quote, socialist character, end quote, of the Soviet Union, as Sartre was able to write as late as February 1956, the, quote, extraordinary objective intelligence, end quote, of the French Communist Party. There's a book by Ian Birchall called Sartre Against Stalinism or something like that, and from what I know about Sartre, at least in the 1950s and 1960s, maybe a lot in the 1950s, but definitely in like the 1950s, it was definitely like pro-Stalinist. I think he may have changed his tune later, but I'm not an expert on Sartre. Back to the text. Small groups of Trotskyists, anarchists, or followers of Ortega also emerged, but in addition to their inability to make their voices heard, they were hindered by their authoritarian structures and their theoretical sterility. The Trotskyists could not even decide whether the Soviet Union was a class society. It was against the background of disagreements of this kind that Socialissime Barbarie was formed in 1949. Socialissime Barbarie and Socialissime Barbarie's journal of the same name, soon became the only passable theoretical voice of independent Marxism in France. To begin with, however, this position did not differ significantly from that of the, quote, left communists, end quote, of the 1920s, and certainly no attempt was made to connect Marxist revolutionary theory with the avant-garde injunction to, quote, change life, end quote. That's a little bit disputable. But I would say that Socialissime Barbarie definitely focused, at least is manifested in the works of Castoriadis, which I know best, it definitely focuses on like changing like productive life, which is actually considerably revolutionary, considering that like the actual experience and the methods of production were taken as neutral by large parts of the radical left, who kind of viewed socialism in some sense as an egalitarian distribution of wealth based on a highly alienating labor process as like the goal of like socialism and the realization of communism. So there's the injunction to change life was accounted for by Socialissime Barbarie, and especially I think this is true of like the later works of Castoriadis, in which I think Socialissime Barbarie, I can't remember it right now, but I think it folded in 66 or 67, around the same time that Society of the Spectacle was published. Anyway, that's just my thoughts on that. It is thus not absurd to claim that the letterism of Isidore Isot, for all its limitations, represented the only truly groundbreaking movement in France's post-war period. Footnote: a view shared by Richard Gambin, a sociologist much more interested by Marxist groups than by artistic tendencies. See his Les Origines des Gauchisme, in 1971, translated in English by Michael K. Pearl, The Origins of Modern Leftism. Yeah, I think that's a very clumsy assertion. But that's kind of like, just as a side note, like that's kind of like this guy's like Anselm Jappe, and like even to some degree Debord's, like their whole vibe is just like kind of like arrogant and dismissive and like, I don't know, maybe that's not true of Jappe, but it kind of is. It's kind of like cool guy Marxism. Like its kind of vibe is like, it has that like pretentiousness of like the avant-garde art world, that in my personal opinion is fucking insufferable. But not that I am against pretense, but I'm against kind of like an added kind of like vibrato, but kind of like an added like, oh, the only thing, we're the only group. It's like, no, the situationists and this group were clearly fitting into a broader, very intellectual milieu in France. Not that, obviously Stalinism was dominant, but it's certainly not like, as a person very much interested in socialisme barbarie, to act as if letterism was the only groundbreaking theoretical movement in this period is just, in my opinion, bullshit. Anyway, just as the activity of the situationists in the 60s was an attempt to respond to the new social conjuncture created by a modernizing capitalism, so the early stages of that activity in the years of the Letterist International cannot be detached from the rapid and radical change that France underwent in the 50s. At the beginning of that decade, France's economy was rather backward in comparison with the economies of the country's northern neighbors. For instance, the percentage of the population employed in agriculture was 27%, against 13% for the Netherlands. Within a very few years, however, France caught up with the most highly developed countries. Productivity was soon increasing at a faster rate in France than anywhere else in the world, and between 1953 and 1957, French industrial output rose by 57%, even though an average increase for all European countries was only 33%. That's fucking insane. It's a very, very very steep increase in industrial output. And the footnote says, these figures are from Cornelius Castoriadis, quote, Perspective de la crise française. Or Française, I don't know. Anyway, end footnote. Nor was economic growth the only factor here. Rather, a qualitative transition occurred that profoundly affected daily life and introduced the, quote, style, end quote, so succinctly described by the French as métro, boulot, dodo. The high point of the activity of the young members of the Letterist International corresponds exactly to the brief period between 1954 and 1956, which some sociologists now think witnessed the culmination of, quote, a second silent French Revolution, end quote, the rest of the country violently from, quote, its still traditional framework, end quote, and ushered in the, quote, alienation, end quote, of our time. Footnote. Matériau pour surveiller à l'histoire intellectuelle de la France, 1953 to 1987. La Débat, 50. I don't know. That's from May-August 1988 is the source. So end footnote. Where am I? France's first television program was broadcast in 1953. In 1955, washing machines appeared on the market for the first time. In the same year, the first Grand Ensemble, I don't know, or high-rise, quote, moderate-income housing, end quote, went up in Sarkel, a kind of development that would soon ravage the outskirts of all French cities. Between 1954 and 1956, French consumers' spending on household appliances doubled. In 1957, there were 6 times as many college students in France as there had been 20 years earlier. This particularly sudden eruption of modernity, which in many other countries had begun arriving much earlier, meant that capitalist modernization was easier to see coming in France than it was elsewhere, and the young generation was especially sensitive to the change. The significance of the Letterist International and the Situationist International lies in the fact that they were among the first people to see these new developments as the basis for a new class struggle. The question, so often repeated in their publications, quote, will these modern means help realize human desires, end quote, takes on its full resonance only if it is placed in the context of the most thoroughgoing restructuring of daily life that France had ever known. The activity of the Letterists, as the dissidents of the Letterist International called themselves, simply not wishing to concede this title to those who are still loyal to Issot, cannot be separated from a Paris that was still for a time the cultural capital of the world, a place where the various factions of the intelligentsia could assume their quarrels were of world historical significance simply by virtue of where they were conducted. Later, Debord would evoke the beauty of the Paris of his youth, quote, when for the last time it shone with so intense a fire, end quote. In those days, young people from every corner of the globe continued to come to Paris and sleep under the bridges, if need be, just so as to be there. The center of the city was still inhabited by a people, in the old meaning of the word, descended from the same populace that had so often in the past risen to throw off the yoke of its masters. A few years later, all of this came to an end as the Situationists were the first to record. May 1968 was itself an attempt by the young to take back a city that had long represented a space of freedom for them, but that by the 1960s had completely changed. Footnote, see Louis Chevalier, L'assassinat de Paris, I guess it's Assassination of Paris, published in 1977. For example, this is a book that was much appreciated by Debord. End footnote. The new quote, international, end quote, was comprised of a dozen or so young people, some of them North Africans or foreigners living in Paris. This was the extent of the group's internationalism. The Letterists despised existentialism, even though in a sense the Letterists were themselves objectively a sort of extremist wing of existentialism, for the Letterists too incarnated a tragic antagonism between subjectivity and the outside world. Footnote. Debord, however, in his film on the passage of a few persons through a rather brief period of time, which celebrated the Letterist milieu in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I don't know, had to this to say, quote, these people also scorned, quote, subjective profundity, end quote. They were interested in nothing but an adequate concrete expression of themselves, end quote. End footnote. Even if everything did not always go swimmingly in the 3 or 4 bars where they juggled their slim resources and avoided the attention of the police, they had a very high opinion of themselves, disdaining the world around them, along with all those who, unlike them, were not determined to break with the bourgeois lifestyle. Footnote. Many documents and iconographic items relating to the life of the young Letterist will be found in Gaudel Marcus' Lipstick Traces and in Oort, Phantom Avant-Garde. Both Marcus and Oort draw too on interviews given them by various sometime Letterists, end footnote. They looked upon themselves as at any rate, after certain purely nihilistic elements had been expelled, as an avant-garde that had moved beyond art itself, and they expressed the firm conviction that their, quote, works, though practically inexistent, would leave their mark on history, end quote. Rejecting the dismal life offered by the whole society in which they lived, the Letterists wanted their epic to be based on the quest for passion and adventure. This was not the 60s when the, quote, underground, end quote, was fashionable and widely accepted, but a time when a group of this kind inevitably remained isolated and surrounded by enemies. All of this conferred an extraordinary intensity upon encounters and events. Looking back later, Debord would often sing the praises of this heroic period, although Debord always noted that for many of the participants, the adventure did not have a happy ending. In 1953, after a number of expulsions, the Letterist International crystallized around a solid core of members, notable among them, aside from Debord, being Debord's wife, Michelle Bernstein, Mohamed Dahou, Jacques Filon, and Jill J. Woolman, who had made a Letterist film in 1952. Apart from the sporadic distribution of carte de visite, bearing such messages as, quote, if you think you have genius, or if you think you have only a brilliant intelligence, write the Letterist International, end quote, or, quote, create a little situation for yourself with no prospects, end quote. The Letterists addressed the public by means of small mimeographed bulletins. Thus, between 1952 and 1954, 4 numbers of International Letterist appeared, and between 1954 and 1957, 29 issues of Potlatch. In all likelihood, nobody would now remember that Lee Letterist International, had not Debord made his start there. In all likelihood, nobody would now remember the Letterist International had not Debord made his start there, but as a matter of fact, the Letterist pronouncements are certainly memorable on their own account. For instance, quote, "The most dazzling displays of intelligence mean nothing to us. Political economy, love, and urban planning are means we must master in order to solve a problem that is first and foremost of an ethical kind. Nothing can release life from its obligation to be absolutely passionate. We know how to proceed. The world's hostility and trickery notwithstanding, the participants in an adventure that is altogether daunting are gathering and making no concessions. We consider generally that there is no honorable way of living apart from this participation." End quote. Below this text appears 7 signatures in the best surrealist tradition. Quote, "Even though almost everything that happens in this world provokes our anger and disgust," end quote, asserts the letterist, quote, "we are nevertheless more and more able to find it amusing," end quote, and they rejected the common idea that life is sad. In their refusal of work and vague aspirations to, quote, "revolution," end quote, in their promotion of subjective experience, and in their, after all, very real degree of cultivation, the letterists closely resembled the early surrealists. The difference was that the young letterists were more uncouth, more negative, but also more sincere. They were indeed very young. In the summer of 1953, their average age was about 21, or more precisely, according to calculations made some years later, the Letterist International's average age was 23 at the time of its foundation and dropped to 20.8 years a few months later as a consequence of internal purges. God, that makes me feel old. Some measure of the absolute seriousness with which the young letterists took their activities is given by this propensity to statistical exactitude, as by the characterization of purges within the group as, quote, "lively factional struggles and expulsions of superannuated group leaders," end quote, by the fact that their paper could report a letterist meeting held to decide on the exact text of short inscriptions to be written in chalk or certain places in the city, or by their long discussion at another meeting of whether all churches should be demolished or merely converted to other uses. Their pursuit of adventure, passion, and play was supposed to be conducted with a rigor reminiscent of a revolutionary organization on the Leninist model. Under pain of expulsion, every gesture, every word of a member had to correspond to the spirit of the group, and all contact with excludees, even on a private basis, was strictly taboo. These were times of extreme eclecticism in every sphere, yet the Letterist International demanded of its members that they break utterly with all aspects of the world outside, as much on the plane of thought as on that of lived experience. The value of an individual was measurable by reference to what that individual was satisfied with, a yardstick to which Debord remained firmly loyal even afterwards. This total refusal to compromise with the outside, quote, "We have no truck with those who do not think as we do," end quote, or even with each other, quote, sooner change one's friends than change one's ideas," end quote, was possibly more typical of the letterists and situationists than any other single trait, and it would earn them countless rebukes and accusations of, quote, "Stalinism," end quote. And indeed, the overwhelming majority of the members of these organizations ended up being expelled on the basis of motions brought by Debord. It is no coincidence that a détournement of a remark by Saint Just is how it would sound in English, but I think it's Saint Just. I'm not sure. May be found twice in the very few pages dating from the earliest days of International Letterist. Quote, "Human relations must be founded on passion or else on terror," end quote. Still, letterist discipline differs from the Leninist variety in that Leninist rigor is invariably bound up with a tactical consideration and the desire to recruit as many adherents as possible, each of whom is expected merely to express formal agreement with the party's principles, whereas the Letterist International or Situationist International, sought to retain a minimum of members only, but required that the participation of each be flawless. The justification for this attitude was the need for self-defense of a group operating under difficult conditions, and convinced that the degeneration of other groups was caused by an excess of internal tolerance. It is worth pointing out, however, that this characteristic combination of a quest for disorder with a call for rigor is yet another feature linking the young letterist to surrealism. which had been responsible for introducing expulsions, splits, and orthodoxies into the world of art. The relationship between the Debord tendency and the original surrealists is an ambiguous one, but the young letterist view of the version of surrealism contemporary with them could not have been clearer. They called it, quote, a festering theosophical agony, end quote. Footnote: the sole direct contact between the Letterist International and the French Surrealists was destined to end badly. In the fall of 1954, the two groups agreed to mount a protest together against the official festivities marking the Rimbaud centenary. The Surrealists backed out, however, deeming a joint text written for the occasion, "Ca commence bien," bracket, a good start, end bracket, to be too, quote, Marxist, end quote. In a leaflet, they accused the Letterists of being Stalinist falsifiers and publicity hounds. And the Letterists responded with a flyer of their own, and Debord, et ca finit mal, bracket, and a bad end, exclamation point, end bracket. For that, the whole exchange sheet, Berbi. Surrealism's most ferocious epigons never forgave the Letterists for this episode, and almost 30 years afterwards they were still accusing them of having laid a, quote, trap, end quote, for the Surrealists and of being dogmatists bent on subordinating artistic freedom to politics. See the comments on this passage in José Pierre, Tracts Surréalistes et Déclarations Collectives, too. End footnote. Breton in particular was the butt of near Oedipal hatred. In a 1953 a 20-line, quote, manifesto, end quote, announced that, quote, present-day society is divided only solely into letterists on the one hand and snitches on the other, and among the latter, André Breton is the most notorious, end quote. Jesus Christ. In Potlatch, the letterists devote, quote, bourgeois inquisitors like André Breton or Joseph McCarthy, end quote, and voiced sentiments such as the following, quote, from Gaxotte, I don't know, Gaxotte, I don't know, Gaxotte, I don't fucking know. Quote from Gaxotte, bracket, an ultra-reactionary historian, end bracket, to Breton. Those people whom we find ridiculous all think it sufficient to denounce us solely on account of our non-adherence to their own views of the world, views which turn out to be all much of a muchness, end quote. For Breton's 60th birthday, some Belgian allies of the Letterists sent out fake invitations to several hundred people asking them to an alleged talk by Breton at the Hotel Lutetia on, quote, the eternal youth of surrealism, end quote. The moral of this hoax, according to Potlatch, was that, quote, no claim, no matter how idiotic, will now occasion surprise so long as it has been approved by a surrealist doctrine, end quote. At the same time, the Letterists maintained that, quote, the set of demands once laid down by surrealism, end quote, was a, quote, minimum, end quote. They certainly acknowledged the positive role played by early surrealism, though less by virtue of surrealism's works than by virtue of surrealism's attempt to, quote, change life, end quote, and go beyond art. Surrealism had been a still artistic destruction of art, however, and now a much more important task had to be tackled, neither expressive nor aesthetic in character, namely, quote, the conscious construction of new affective states, end quote. The, quote, construction of situations, end quote, was indeed the key concept of the young letterists. This was something that could not be arrived at merely by asserting some dogma, but called for research and experiment. Footnote. The word, quote, situationist, end quote, appeared for the first time in 1956. End footnote. Debord evoked the construction of situations in his earliest writings, specifically in the already cited single issue of Eon of 1952, and the notion was still in evidence 15 years later in the context of a discussion by him of the way in which the spectacle prevents people from determining their own destinies. The program envisaged did not change, but in the first decade it was essentially conflated with the supersession of art. In the 1950s, it was easy enough to show that cultural innovation was non-existent, and the letterists ridiculed everything that was touted as, quote, new, end quote, and especially Alain Robbe-Grillet as the palest of imitations of historic avant-garde achievements, imitations that no one would have dreamt of taking seriously just a few years earlier. For the letterists, however, it was not a matter of waiting for some genuinely new artistic tendency to come along. Quote, all abstract painting since Malevich has amounted to breaking down open doors, end quote, they wrote. As for the cinema, its, quote, entire field of possible discoveries, end quote, have been exploited to the limit, while, quote, onomatopoeic poetry and neoclassical poetry have simultaneously demonstrated the utter depreciation of this product, end quote. The letterist, even Isso's old guard, had always felt that the successful realization of any newly conceived artistic technique condemned all future exponents of that technique to the status of boring imitators. Potlatch offered an original explanation for this stagnation of art. Here, too, quote, the relations of production had entered into contradiction with the necessary development of the forces of production, end quote. Just as the strengthening of man's domination of nature had superseded the idea of God, so likewise new technological advances would make the supersession of aesthetics possible and necessary. The church was, quote, a sort of monument to everything not yet dominated in the world, end quote. Art was their heir to religion, for it expressed the fact that man was not capable of using the new means now available to make a different everyday life for himself. It was precisely because a new order of things had emerged as a possibility that the mere voicing a disagreement was now useless. This is the sense of Debord and Woolman's assertion that letterism was not a, quote, literary school, end quote, but rather an experimental search for a new, quote, way of living, end quote. Potlatch called for the unity of life and art, not to lower art to the level of life as it was previously lived, but instead to raise life to the level promised by art. The richness of life that art promised, just like the techniques for intensifying sensation that were characteristic of artistic practice, ought to be attainable within the realm of everyday experience. In this way, the letterist hoped to go beyond the surrealists. Breton had spoke of, quote, beauty, which has quite obviously never been envisaged here with anything but passionate aims in mind, end quote. Yet the surrealists had been content merely to write books in which they loudly proclaimed to the necessity of living the new values instead of just describing them. Footnote, André Breton, Nadia, English translation by Richard Howard, end footnote. In 1925, the surrealists had declared, quote, we have nothing to do with literature, but we are quite capable, if need be, of making use of literature like everyone else. 2. Surrealism is not a new means of expression, nor a simpler means of expression. 3. We are determined to create a revolution, end quote. Footnote, Déclaration du... I don't know if I can... Fuck it, I can't read that. The History of Surrealism. Translated by Richard Howard in Maurice Nadeau, The History of Surrealism, published in 1967. End footnote. Things did not work out quite according to plan, however. If poetry and books was dead, it was, quote, now to be found in the form of cities, end quote, and it could be, quote, read on people's faces, end quote. But merely seeking poetry out wherever it might be was not enough, for the beauty of cities or of faces had to be constructed. Quote, the new beauty will be situational, end quote. Unlike the surrealists, the letterists expected to find little in the nooks and crannies of reality. In dreams or in the unconscious, reality itself had instead to be remade. Quote, the adventurer is one who makes adventures happen rather than one to whom adventures happen, end quote. An admirable motto that would be a good epigraph for Debord's whole journey. The function of the arts henceforth would be to combine into a new lifestyle, and in the early days of the letterist spoke in this connection of a, quote, integral art, end quote. The situation that the future situationists were forever pursuing always had a material aspect, and the complete and authentic construction of situations meant a new urbanism in which all the arts would be mobilized in the creation of a passion-filled atmosphere. One second. The letterist interest in urbanism arose from their notion of, quote, psychogeography, end quote, by which the letterist meant the systematic observation of the effects produced by different urban ambiances upon the emotions. In this vein, the letterist published several descriptions of the zones into which the city could be subdivided from the psychogeographical point of view, as well as accounts of specific places considered in this light. Footnote. See, for example, Potlatch 109-10 and Berbe 300 and 324 to 326, end footnote. Such findings were the product of what the letterist called dérive, rambles based on, quote, a technique of passing hastily through varied ambiances, end quote. Debord. Dérive would take the best part of a day, during which the explorers would allow themselves to be guided, quote, by the solicitations of the terrain and of chance encounters, end quote. The role of chance would be reduced as familiarity with the territory grew, and it would thus become possible to choose which solicitations to respond to. But only a, quote, unitary urbanism, end quote, represented a complete solution, the creation of ambiances that did not merely allow feelings to find expression, but actually provoked new feelings. Interest in an anti-functionalist architecture of this kind grew during the period of letterist agitation, becoming one of the earliest points of convergence with the other European artistic groups that subsequently joined with the letterists to found the Situationist International. Rather than create entirely new forms, the letterists wanted to take already existing elements and rearrange them. This appropriative technique, derived in part from a Dadaist collage, in part from a kind of distorted quotation favored by both Marx and Letterist, they gave the name détournement. Détournement involves a quotation, or more generally a reuse that, quote, adapts, end quote, the original element to a new context. It is also a way of transcending the bourgeois cult of originality and the private ownership of thought. In some cases, the products of bourgeois civilization, even the most insignificant products of bourgeois civilization, such as advertisements, may be reemployed in such a way as to modify their meaning. In other cases, the effect may be to reinforce the real meaning of an original element. A sentence of Marx's, say, by changing its form. Dadaist collage restricted itself to the devaluing pole of the, quote, devaluing/revaluing, end quote, dialectic that is the basis of all détournement. In the first instance, the technique is indeed, quote, the negation of the value of the previous organization of expression, end quote, but the elements used acquire a new meaning, and from the outset Debord sought to go beyond the pure negativity of Dada. Systematized theoretically in 1956 in an article by Debord and Wohlmann, détournement became a letterist and situationist trademark. Instances of its application include Oscar Jorn's repainted kitsch pictures, comic strips with rewritten bubbles, and Debord's films, almost entirely composed of pre-existing cinematic elements. The supreme example must be the Society of the Spectacle, identifying all of whose textual détournements calls for a considerable erudition. Footnote. Here are a few of the détournements of Marx and Hegel to be found in the Society of the Spectacle. So it's like Capital Volume 1, The Phenomenology of Mind, Speech on the Anniversary of the People's Paper, Marx's Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts, Manifesto of the Communist Party, A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Introduction, Letters from Marx to Ruge, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Marx's Hegel's Philosophy of Right, Preface to the Critique of Political Economy, and so those are some of the things that are détournement. Oh, this is a continued footnote. As for other authors, the latter portion of Section 14 appropriates a well-known sentence of Edward Bernstein's. Section 21 refers to Freud's celebrated principle in his The Interpretation of Dreams, according to which, quote, dreams are the guardians of sleep, end quote. And Section 207 is a détournement of l'autrement formulation promoting détournement. In many ways, the Society of the Spectacle comes very close to obeying Walter Benjamin's injunction to write a book composed entirely of quotations. Appended to the 1998 edition of Debord and Sanguinetti's La Véritable, I don't know, Session dans l'International, is a list drawn up by Debord of some of the détournements to be found in that work. End footnote. The creations of the past were thus neither deprecated nor regarded with undue respect, but rather, in terms that Debord employed as late as 1960, quote, used for propaganda purposes, end quote. Some borrowings were made over and over again in Debord's work, case in point being the passage from the Communist Manifesto on the, quote, heavy artillery which the bracket bourgeoisie and bracket batters down all Chinese walls, end quote. A sentence from Bossuet's Panégyrique de Bernard de Clairvaux. Bernard, this green youth that will not last forever. Or, quote, Bernard. This green youth will not last forever. In the metaphor of the search for the Northwest Passage, taken from Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, in the broadest sense, Debord's whole conception of society is founded on détournement. All the elements needed for a free life are already to hand, both culturally and technologically speaking. They have merely to be modified as to their meanings and organized differently. It was not very hard to set forth, quote, utopian, end quote, programs such as that of, quote, unitary urbanism, end quote. Isso's old guard letterist had done something of the sort, as had many others. What made the Letterist International different was its search for practical means with which to realize the program, and from the outset the young letterist tended to embrace the traditions of political revolution. In 1954, Debord wrote that, quote, at least the best reasons for civil war will not be in short supply, end quote. The Letterist International called upon, quote, proletarian revolutionary parties to organize armed interventions in support of the new revolution, end quote, in Spain. Yet the French Communist Party aroused no sympathy whatsoever among the letterists, and one might well ask who the said revolutionary parties were. The fact is that in its first few years of existence, the Letterist International was simply a boheme that placed vague hopes in a somewhat mythical, quote, revolution, end quote. It was nevertheless during this period that the letterists laid the groundwork for projects developed later, despite the continuing presence of a proletariat in the classic sense. They were among the first to glimpse the unprecedented way in which the social question was beginning to reframe itself. What would happen to the increasing amount of free time available to the population in general? Would modern technology allow people to live lives governed by play and desire, or would it merely create new forms of alienation? Quote, the real problem of revolution is the problem of leisure time. Economic constraints and their moral corollaries are in any event bound soon to be destroyed and transcended. The organization of leisure, is already a necessity for the capitalist state, as the organization of leisure is for its Marxist heirs. On all sides, however, the only response has been the inescapable stupefacions of sports stadium and television set, Unless this question is not openly addressed before the collapse of the reigning system of economic exploitation, that change will be nothing but a travesty, end quote. Uttered in 1954, these were truly prophetic words at a time when the phenomenon evoked was in its infancy, and the fact that they came neither from a sociologist nor from a professional Marxologist makes them all the more striking. In a perfectly consistent manner, the letterists rejected the trade unionism and purely economic demands in order to pose, quote, the problem of the survival or destruction of the system, end quote. And the letterists did this on the basis of a well-nigh, quote, existentialist, end quote, principle, namely that, quote, life passes and we can expect no compensation aside from those that we have to invent and build ourselves, end quote. They took note of the total degeneration of the left, which was incapable even of offering concrete support to the cause of a free Algeria. But their basic detachment with respect to, quote, politics, end quote, meant that they confined themselves to very, very brief comments on domestic and international developments without ever attempting more detailed analysis. The secret of the seductiveness of situationist theories in the 1960s lay in their desire to combine the content of the new revolution as heralded by art with the practical means for realizing it, including those of the old workers' movement. This goal was already clearly embraced in the early days of the Letterist International, but it was several years before the Letterists managed to give this goal a consistent programmatic form. First, as Debord would put it later, the Letterist International had to get beyond its, quote, self-satisfied nihilism, end quote, excessive sectarianism, end quote, and, quote, inactive purity, end quote. A first step in this direction was the group's collaboration with the Belgian magazine Le Lève Nuit, or Nu, L-E-S space L-E with an accent V-R-E-S N-U-E-S, edited by the surrealist Marcel Marien, where a number of Letterist articles appeared. But the Letterist friendship with the Danish painter Asger Jorn turned out to be an even more productive connection. Jorn, along with Dutch painter and architect Constant Nieuwenhuis. I think that's how you say that. It's kind of like the it's kind of spelled like the Dutch, like old, like early kind of like council communist or like libertarian communist precursor or something. Is it Domela? It's like Nieuwenhuis is how it looks, but I think it's pronounced Neuenhaus. I'm not sure. Had organized the group. Constant Neuenhaus had organized the group Cobra between 1948 and 1951, striving to recover the revolutionary spirit of surrealism through an art that was expressionist in character. In 1955, in Italy, Jorn and the Piedmontese painter Giuseppe Galizio founded the, quote, experimental laboratory, end quote, of the international movement of the Imaginist Bauhaus, which the Letterist International had also recently joined. Jorn had many friends in different European countries, so did Debord, and the outcome of many contacts among all these people was a first Congress dedicated to the search for a common platform, held at Alba in the Italian Piedmont in September 1956, with participants from 8 countries. In the following months, quite a few of these would fall by the wayside, but in July 1957, in Cosio d'Aroscia, on the Ligurian coast, 8 people decided to found the Situationist International. A few months later, the new organization had members in Italy, France, Great Britain, Germany, Belgium, Holland, Algeria, and Scandinavia. Most of them were painters, and as a practical matter, their common ground did not extend very far beyond the theme of unitary urbanism and of experimentation aimed at the creation of quote, new ambiances, end quote, capable of fostering new types of behavior and opening the way to a civilization founded on play. Debord clearly acknowledged that this alliance between letterist radicalism and forces still developed within the framework of artistic activity might be seen as, quote, a step backwards, end quote, but he argued that the letterists could no longer continue, quote, to conduct an external opposition, end quote, and must now, quote, seize control of modern culture and use modern culture for our own purposes, end quote, to be at once, quote, in and against, end quote, a decaying cultural sphere, obviously exposed one to the risk of regression, yet it also opened up the prospect of a broader-based project of supersession. This possibility was very much in phase with the apparent dissipation of post-war apathy, and the Letterist International evoked a, quote, general revolutionary renewal characteristic of the year 1956, end quote, which witnessed not only important developments in Algeria and Spain, but above all, large-scale revolts in Poland and Hungary. The traditional left had totally discredited itself, and culture had reached such a state of decay that no one could be unaware of it. The moment might well, therefore, be auspicious for the emergence of a new revolutionary force, even one still struggling to achieve its own coherence. The end. Thanks for listening. The next section is titled The Situationists in Art.